Hello. Today, I am going to talk about the Erland Point Massacre, sometimes known as the Hammer Murders. This topic is a huge part of why this podcast exists. The first time I ever heard this story was flipping through this hefty local history book I found in the middle of a thrift store, and bam, big letters, Erland's Point Massacre. Wait, what? A massacre? On Erland's Point? I immediately bought that book and took it home. You know, my mom loved true crime, and we used to hang out on her bed watching serial killer documentaries and old CSI episodes and the Investigation Discovery Channel. I think she would have gone bananas over this, and I just couldn't believe I'd never heard of it. I do have one disclaimer before I start, though. There's a lot of conflicting and biased information out there regarding these murders. I am going to do my best to put it into a cohesive but also entertaining narrative for you. In the end, you may want to go look it up and decide what you believe happened for yourself. Let's set the scene, shall we? On the afternoon of March 31st, 1934, which was the Saturday before Easter Sunday, Thomas Sanders went for a walk to find out whose dogs were constantly barking. The dogs had been barking for a couple of days, and it was really driving him crazy. So he went out to find them, and he found 2 or 3 dogs locked inside a sedan. It was parked near the home of Frank and Anna Fleiter. How do you say that name? Fleiter? Fleiter? I think I'm going to go with Fleiter. If I'm wrong, someone can let me know. Thomas got the dogs out of the car, calmed them down, gave them some food and water, and knocked on the door of the house. There was no answer, door was locked, all of the blinds were drawn. He did a loop around the house and found that all of the blinds were drawn except for one set in the back looking in on the sunroom of the house. Those blinds were caught halfway up. It was dark inside, but with a flashlight, Thomas could shine inside and see 2 prone bodies. He immediately went to call the sheriff's office and Louis Fleiter, who was Frank Fleiter's brother. The sheriff and his deputies arrived on the scene and entered the home. Inside, they found 6 people dead. Yes, 6. And this is where the real conflicting information starts. Some sources describe the victims with wholesome everyday jobs like grocers and bartenders or actors. Other sources throw darker, unconfirmable information in there, and I'm not sure how much of it is hearsay. There are things in the Red Book that aren't in the more historical accounts. I don't know if this is because the Red Book is like a hyper-local history book, and maybe there was just more information floating about locally? Or is it because the gossip mill started turning? I mean, either way, it's possible that there is a seed of truth behind some of it. The victims were Frank Fleiter, 45 years old, a retired grocer, but also possibly a gambling man and heavy drinker. His body was found in the living room, hands tied, dead from a blow to the head. Anna Taylor Fleiter, 51, was Frank's wife. Before she married Frank, she was a wealthy widow. Anna was found in her bed, bound, gagged, with her throat cut, having sustained a blow to the head. The third victim was Eugene, this is another name. It looks like a Chenevert, maybe like a French, like a soft T, Chenevert or Chenevert. I'm going to go with Chenevert. He was 51. He was a former prize fighter and a vaudevillian, which is a sort of theater actor. He was found dead from a blow to the head near the fireplace in the living room, and it looked like he had put up quite a fight. His wife was also there, Margaret or Peggy Chenevert. She was 48, also a vaudeville actress. She was found shot to death near the sofa in the sunroom. The fifth victim was Magnus Jordan, 62, a retired sailor and a neighbor of the Fleiters, found shot to death at the card table in the sunroom. And the final and sixth victim was Ezra, or Fred Balcom. He was 56 years old, a local bartender, found dead from a blow to the head. Also, his throat cut. I guess he could have died from either one. They're not sure which. Stuffed into the closet of Mrs. Flighter's bedroom, Anna's bedroom. There are also some reports that some of the victims had their eyes taped shut, and that one of them who was shot may have been shot through the eye, but I couldn't find any hard information about that. In the home, many possible murder weapons were discovered. This included a carpenter's hammer, a blackjack. I had to look this one up. A blackjack is a type of bludgeoning weapon with a short or flexible strap. You could swing it. There was also a stove poker and 2 carving knives found. They were all covered in blood. No firearm was found, despite the fact that some people had bullet wounds. There was blood on the floors, the walls, the ceiling, broken bottles and glass on the floors, along with playing cards, poker chips. The house had been tossed. Drawers had been emptied. Wedding rings were missing from the women's fingers. Wallets were missing from the men's pockets. The Flighters had been known around town for their money and for their fun parties, so perhaps it was a robbery gone wrong? At this point, the sheriff appointed a deputy in charge of looking after the scene and went to call the Seattle police for help. The bad news is that the deputy left in charge was not a responsible individual. He was in charge of the crime scene for the rest of the day, and as looky-loos started to gather, he saw an opportunity. According to the Kitsap Sun, which might have been Bremerton Sun at the time, the name changes at some point, quote, he charged a crowd of 150 people 25 cents each to walk through the house and view the slaughter. The gawkers scattered gum wrappers, and one woman stole the stockings off of Anna Flighter's legs, end quote. By the end of the day, newspapers in Seattle had been made aware of the murders, and reporters started coming across on the ferry boats. They found the home mostly unguarded and went in and took pictures of everything. The phone in the home had been ripped out of the wall, possibly during the crime. So the reporters actually went to neighbors' houses and knocked on their doors, asking to use their phones so that they could call their stories back into the Seattle newspapers. The Seattle Post-Intelligencer printed photos of the crime scene, and man, these photos are gruesome. If you've ever seen the Lizzie Borden photos, they remind me a little of that. I will drop a link down in the show notes. Don't say I didn't warn you. And this was the state of the crime scene when Seattle detective Luke May arrived on Easter morning. He collected as much evidence as he could, and he took it back to Seattle to analyze it. Though he did draw some conclusions before he left. There was a large amount of blood on the kitchen floor and broken glass, but no bodies in the kitchen. And none of the victims had sustained any extensive cuts or bleeding wounds. The 2 with their throat cuts were contained to the bedroom. So he theorized that one of the assailants must have sustained a wound, possibly during a fight in the kitchen. He also guessed that there must have been at least 2 assailants, one to tie up the victims while the other held them at gunpoint. Detective May thought that whoever killed these people must have had knowledge of their lifestyle and the parties that they threw in order to plan such a robbery. The date of the murders was also in the air at this point. Neighbors stated that they had heard the dogs barking for days, maybe since Wednesday or Thursday. Inquiries around town turned up mixed information. A butcher reported that he had sold pork chops to Frank on Thursday. Ezra's roommate said that he had seen Ezra on Thursday having a beer in the smoke shop. A tavern owner said he had charged 12 bottles of beer to one of the victims on Thursday. But Thursday's newspaper was found still in the mailbox, never having been brought inside, which in 1934 is a pretty big deal. That was how they got their news. People used to bring in the paper in the morning and read it and drink their coffee. So local investigators, they thought the murders must have been committed on Thursday, but Detective May from the newspapers thought it might have happened differently. So Detective May takes the evidence back to Seattle and an investigation begins, but it quickly fizzles out. Some tips come into the local police. One woman calls and says she knows who the killer is because she has Anna's blood-covered stockings, but it turns out she had stolen them off of her body during her 25-cent tour of the crime scene. A report comes in that a man with a bloody head wound was seen on the ferry back to Seattle, but he couldn't be located. 2 bartenders reported that they gave shelter to a woman who had turned up Thursday morning, soaking wet from the rain, covered in mud, her clothing ripped and torn. So the police located that woman, Letha Peterson, in Seattle. They brought her in for questioning, and she told them that she had been out on a bad date with a sailor and he had tried to rough her up, so she had fled his car and run back to town for help in the rain. All of the other leads dried up, and the case went cold for the next 18 months. And that's where we're going to break for now. I feel like this episode is going to be a little long, so I'm going to split this into 2 smaller parts for easier listening. And if you're not sure where Erland's Point is, I will put a little pin on a Google map for you. Erland's Point is in West Bremerton. It's between NAD Park and Chico, essentially. You know, like Jackson Park and the Navy Hospital are very close to Erland's Point. Alright, well, stay tuned for part 2. Subscribe if you're enjoying the content. If you have any burning questions about Bremerton, as always, please send them to me. We are on all of the usual social media as @Bremelore. Thanks for listening. Bye. You know, that is just the never-ending problem. Do I let the microphone record and then spend hours and hours going back and editing out all of my ums? Then record. Whatever. Waste hours of your life.